Dan Beckerman and Amy Baer are producers on Ali Abbasi's The Apprentice. Thank you for being here. This movie made a lot of waves in the industry after premiering at Cannes, and then it sort of sat there and got stuck waiting for distribution. They tried to block things. How did it feel to finally get this film released and out into the public?
Um, I think it was extraordinarily satisfying, probably certainly more than almost any other movie I've worked on. I can't speak for my partner in crime here, but to me, the measure of success was actually getting it in theaters. That was a huge accomplishment for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was getting it out, but I think the really satisfying thing was that it truly wasn't what anyone expected, we had people like Roger Stone on the Trump side of the equation saying that he thought that Jeremy's performance as Roy Cohn was exactly spot on, and people on the other side of the spectrum also loving it, and it frustrating some people because it didn't fit their expectations. That's okay too. But just generally, I think the film has something to say that wasn't being, despite the incredible volume of noise and content about the subject matter, we really did have something new to say and new to add. And I think people who've seen it agree with that, and it's clear it's going to have an ongoing life because of that, I think.
Well, it had this reputation for being controversial when really no one had seen it. That was saying it because it's not that controversial. It's really just about this man who's taken under the wing of a mentor and how that develops into the person we know he is today. What were your thoughts when you saw the film for the first time?
Um, I think the script always had a modicum of empathy for both of its main characters, which I think was its strength and the thing that also scared a lot of people about it. I remember early days when we were first putting it together, a lot of people in town were very uncomfortable with reading it and feeling empathy and at least understanding who these two men were, particularly Donald Trump, because he's still very much in our zeitgeist. But I think that what was so remarkable about it was their performances and Ali's ability to really walk that line and make sure that the audience understood where these two people were coming from as humans. And I also think the way Ali evoked New York in the late 70s is very authentic. Dan and I remember when we first saw the first cut, we both immediately called each other and said, "Holy cow, that's a really good movie," because you do this so often, and you great movies can end up being a long way away from where they were when you first see it. But the movie was all there the first time we saw it.
Yeah, when I first saw it, I remember watching it and it felt like a movie from the 70s. Like it felt authentic to the time. Dan, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I echo a lot of what Amy said, and making quite a few movies over my career, you just get used to the first cut you see being depressing, to be honest. And that was very much not the case with this. When we were talking about festival premieres and Cannes, we didn't really take it that seriously. We'd be ready in time for Cannes, but when we saw the first cut, it was just so solid, and the movie was so clear that was there. I don't think has done. And that made us think that Cannes was possible, uh, because that first cut was so strong.
And for Sebastian Stan to take this role and deliver the way he does, I mean, it's impressive because when you're playing Donald Trump, I was thinking going into this, I mean, if he doesn't like push the brakes a little bit, like it's easy to go into like Saturday Night Live territory. And he so perfectly just plays it spot on. Um, why was Sebastian the right man for this part?
Um, there's so many ways to answer that question. You know, on a very superficial level, you wanted someone who was both good looking and a great actor. Donald was very good looking in his youth. and was considered very good looking and a sort of eligible bachelor. Um, but I think Sebastian is a still water that runs very deep. And I think a lot of people look at his work early days on Gossip Girl and, he's, Bucky Barnes. But the reality is, if you look at the breadth of his work, he is pretty fearless when it comes to taking on deeper, edgier, more interesting roles and more ambitious roles. And he's also not afraid to play real people. So I think that it was a combination of elements that made him the right person for it. He also was leaning in. We had a lot of conversations with a lot of actors in general, not just for the role of Donald Trump. And there was trepidation in the same way there was trepidation in reading the script and feeling like, oh, we're not sure. We feel, it makes us feel things we don't want to feel about him. There were actors that were just unwilling to go there. And Sebastian was always intrigued by it. He was always, I think that the thing that made him feel a little bit of trepidation is the very thing that made him want to be that character. And he worked really tirelessly for almost 2 years, really listening to Trump and watching his mannerisms. And we had endless conversations collectively about how important it was that that performance was not a caricature, that that performance was really grounded in a real human being, because we've seen so many caricatures of the persona over certainly the last 8 years. But I think the other piece of it too, and he talks about this all the time, is, he is an immigrant. He's from Romania, and he came here when he was 12. And I think that there's a part of that character and the belief in the American dream and, building something and being ambitious that really speaks to him as a citizen. So I think he was just the right, perfect choice for so many reasons.
Yeah. And Dan, what about Jeremy Strong on the other side of that? Because then we see him and he's someone he really gets to push the gas down. I mean, he goes hard in this movie and he's so great. Talk about Jeremy Strong as Roy Cohn.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously they're incredibly different performances, so complementary. Uh, but I also think Maria Bakalova's performance as Ivana and Martin Donovan's performance as Fred Senior are all on the same level of just
Yeah.
being absolutely superb. And Jeremy, it's just exciting. It's exciting to watch. In the movie, it was exciting to watch on set. And I think what Jeremy brought to Roy, who, whatever people think about Donald Trump, whether they like him or not, Roy is not thought of as a particularly likable guy.
Mhm.
And yet Jeremy brought humanity to it as Sebastian brought to Donald. And I actually do think that that fact that the humanity that they brought and that was in the script, in Gabe's script and in Ali's direction, I think that humanity actually is what makes the movie subversive, because that's something that none of our political discourse is doing. Our political discourse is all about dehumanizing each other, specific groups in certain cases that we're all very familiar with. But dehumanizing is the tool that politics uses to create drama and anger. And for us to approach this subject matter with a dedication to not dehumanize, I think makes it deeply subversive. And I think people might not know what to think of it at first because of that. But when you dig into it, it opens up things that you just don't think about if all you're watching is, the usual partisans online or on cable news. And
Yeah,
that's what I think is so deeply exciting about the
I think
movie.
that's so right. And it one of the things that was so frustrating for so long for us is because nobody could see it, the assumption was it was a hit piece. And there's not one person that I know, and I don't think there's anyone that Dan knows, who has seen the film and thinks it's a hit piece on him. And, you know, it is, and again, Ali talks a lot about this. It is in some ways holding a mirror up to American culture, but is definitively not a hit piece. Um, and I think that, as Dan is saying, the sort of daringness and the subversiveness of it is that we didn't want to make a hit piece. We wanted to make a movie about two human beings who cast a long shadow on our culture, both domestically and around the world. Um, and the only way to um, sort of heal as a culture and move forward is to understand it as opposed to demonizing it. And for so long, that is what the public discourse has been, is to demonize the other. And that really is not what we're interested in doing here. It's
And
certainly
by the way, it doesn't let them off the hook. Just
correct.
because we're not dehumanizing
Correct.
doesn't mean that humans represented fairly don't do terrible things. And in fact, I think one read of the movie is that there's something of a loss of humanity that's occurring in this story. There's a tragic aspect to this story. And I think that again centers on the humanity, but it may be about loss of humanity.
And my favorite scene in the movie is the fight outside of Trump's office when Roy says to him, "Congratulations, you've lost the last trace of humanity you ever had, or last trace of decency you've ever had." And, you know, that is it's the master telling the apprentice, "You finally learned everything I had to teach you." And you feel real pathos there. It's partly the performance, it's partly being a human and seeing that happen to someone, the sort of evolution of somebody going from being ambitious and needy and yearning to really becoming that person. And but it's important that you feel something for Roy in that moment, for sure.
Yeah, there are moments where you do feel bad for both of them, and it's not that they're not doing terrible things at times, but you see where they come from. And part of that is showing Don's upbringing. His father seemed pretty tough, Fred, and we see Fred Jr. sort of struggled in that environment to try to impress his dad, and Don sort of turned that into like a motivation to prove something of himself. I found it interesting because I was looking back and there was a moment in time where Donald Trump said he was nervous of naming his son Don Jr. in case he was a loser. And he didn't want him to have his name. And I was thinking that's so connected to Fred and Fred Jr.
Yeah.
And so talk about their upbringing and Gabriel Sherman's writing and depiction of that.
Well, Gabe covered the Trump campaign in 2016. And because Gabe is by training a journalist and had worked at the New York Observer and it sort of was in that orbit for years, just as a journalist, he became a student of Trump, more by necessity than by desire. He being a good journalist, he wanted to do all the research he possibly could. In very early drafts, and I don't think Dan ever read one of these, in very early drafts, there was a prologue where you saw young Donald with his father and wanting to be a baseball player, wanting to do other things, and Fred Sr. just not valuing any of it and being very dismissive of it. So a lot has been written about how tough Fred Sr. was. Donald himself has talked about it. And I think it was a really important dynamic, and as in the movie, and as Dan said, I think that Martin Donovan is just brilliant playing that role because it's not so overt. It's just sort of this underlying seething that he expects so much from his children. And it's very Shakespearean, but it was all real. I mean, it was very real. All of that dynamic was very authentic.
And I think that this goes back again to our theme of humanization or dehumanization, in that Fred Senior, a scene I love in the movie is the dinner table scene where Fred is deriding his son Fred Jr. and he says, "Oh, so my son is a bus driver with wings," and so it's like mean. It's a little funny, but it just shows that this is a man who basically saw the worth of his children strictly in their accomplishments and how they reflected on him.
Right.
So he really kind of commodified his own children. And I think that says a lot about a few things.
Mhm.
I also had never really heard someone like not be proud of someone for being a pilot. I thought
Right.
that was like a pretty good job.
Yeah, but it's all about money, right? It's
Yeah.
not, doesn't pay that much.
Well, and you spoke briefly about her, but I do want to talk a little bit more about Maria Bakalova, and what she brought to Ivana. How did that choice come about to bring her on? And this is a way for her to show her talent on a whole new level. I thought she was fantastic.
Yeah, she's remarkable in the movie. We credit Ali. He always wanted an Eastern European actress. He felt very strongly that there needed to be an authenticity to the idea of a woman who is grounded culturally in an Eastern European society, sort of dealing with what the American world would be. Um, and the first time he met, a meeting was set up between the two of them, and she showed up in full Ivana hair and makeup. But the first time he met her, he was insistent there was nobody else except her. So we got really lucky having her and her wanting to take it on. And I think um, one of the things, again, is she very much understands who Ivana was as a woman coming from Eastern Europe to the Western culture with ambitions, professional, personal, otherwise. There's a nuance to that from an acting standpoint that if you can get inside of that, you understand it in a way that a non-Eastern European actress might not. They might be able to do the hair and the makeup and the look and the accent, but she really was coming from, I went to London when I was 20, to audition for movies, and I didn't know anyone, but I knew that I couldn't be what I wanted to be in Bulgaria. Um, so she really, really connected with Ivana, and, is very articulate. And I think she's right about the fact that Ivana was very much ahead of her time, right? She was very ambitious personally and professionally, not a gold digger. She wanted to earn what she had. And so much of the branding piece of who Trump became was Ivana's idea. Um, so I think that she brings a lot to it, both as just personally as an actress. And I also think that that role is ballast in the movie. She is the turning point for Donald. He learns so much from his mentor, and then he meets her, and that's when he starts to pivot away from his mentor. And, I think that the full evolution of him from sort of wide eyed, ambitious, but I don't know how to get it done protege to the man that we now know him as comes full circle in their relationship by the end of the movie and the way he treats her.
Well, such an impressive film. Congratulations, and wishing you the best of luck this awards season. And
Thank
thanks for
you.
chatting with Gold Derby today.
Thanks for having us.